All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and entrances. One man in his time plays many parts. So where's this from? You might have known this is from Shakespeare's As You Like It. And it's a very apt metaphor for ways in which people present themselves to others. You may recall that when speaking of the spotlight effect earlier in our interpersonal cognition lecture, I mentioned that people are usually too busy managing their own presentation to have as much time as we generally assume to be noticing and judging ours. One of the skills that you will hone in this class is learning to recognize self-presentation strategies. When these strategies are taught in marketing, the goal, of course, is to make a higher profit. That should be the goal. But in social psychology, we research, study, and teach presentation strategies to better recognize them and thus be less vulnerable to them. In other words, to help us better see people as they really are instead of how they are presenting. We're going to look at 3 different categories of self-presentation. First, we will look at self-promotion strategies, 4 of them. Self-promotion strategies involve managing information about oneself with the goal of appearing competent. Then, ingratiation strategies, again, 4 of them. Ingratiation strategies involve making others feel important to gain their favor and cooperation, you might say. And finally, we will look at 4 status conveying strategies, which involve managing information about the self with the goal of claiming and maintaining higher status. So starting with self-promotion strategies, managing information about the self with the goal of appearing competent. Note that often one's accomplishments are not observed. So the strategy of staging performances is one of seeking and creating opportunities to demonstrate our performances to audiences. Examples would include volunteering to give a talk, placing yourself front and center in a performance group, or suggesting a first date activity in which you just happen to excel. DiMera used this self-promotion strategy often and very carefully. He staged his performances, but around those with little knowledge like staff and students, and he avoided staging in front of professionals. Competence displays is a strategy of using speech, behaviors, and/or props to signal competence. Now, speech can be tricky. Sometimes we are actually expected to talk about our own competence, like a job interview, for example, or self-evaluations. But other than these situations, it can appear immodest, right? Bragging to do so. So it's far more effective if people can get others to make competence claims on their behalf. Now, DiMera's favorite trick was using forged letters of reference from highly credible sources, all glowing in the praise of his credentials. DiMera also used many behaviors and props. Behaviors like taking a while to return phone calls, and props like displaying an impressively filled calendar, degrees, and awards around his office. Self-handicapping is an interesting strategy which involves creating obstacles or excuses for poorer performance, actually creating a win-win situation this way. So DiMera, in a couple of particularly challenging surgeries, claimed he was ill those days, but was working anyway because he was needed. In other words, because of his dedication, right? And think about this win-win situation he created. If he didn't do that well, people tend to blame it on the obstacle. But if he did manage to do well, his talent seems even more impressive. And then our fourth one, appearance enhancement, is based on the fact that attractive people are liked more and believed to have many unrelated, totally unrelated positive traits, like competence. Now, do you happen to know the name of this? It's actually coming up later in a lecture this semester, but it's called the halo effect. So the tendency to think just because someone is good looking, that they have many other unrelated positive traits. So it's not very logical, but it still exists, the halo effect. So this idea of appearance enhancement as a strategy is based on the halo effect. And there are so many examples of this. For instance, attractive people are more likely to be hired into managerial positions. They're paid more, and they're more likely to be elected to public office. They receive lesser fines in misdemeanor cases and shorter sentences in felony cases, etc. High self-promoters expend extra effort with the goal of making themselves physically attractive. So they tend to spend more time in front of a mirror and more money on things like clothing, hair, etc. So here's a good self-promotion strategies review question. Which of our 4 self-promotion strategies is illustrated by this comic? Go ahead and pause the video if you need to. And that would be self-handicapping. Self-handicapping.